Right, the return spring for the B lever is this one here. Fits over this post. There's a ring around that post, a groove that sits into. Normally you can swing it out this way a little bit to make it easier to get the B lever into position. I'll hold back this piece, open the blades up all the way, and see if I can hook my B lever in position. The B lever has got a tiny little notch in the back of there that has to hook into that spring. I need that spring to sit a bit high so we can get into it. No, it's not going to do it for us. That's better. Get that seated over the boss. Yeah, it's seated over the post now. Now its retaining screw has this spring on it. This spring acts against the self-timer setting lever, the post on there. But to get this in place, start it here. Then, because this is awkward, you can see I was using my screwdriver in my left hand just to make things awkward. Now I can swing this spring up and around, back against the lens tube at this side. So now it's acting against this piece over here. If we lift our B lever up, I'm holding that back with my finger, I can pull the blade actuating ring back to the rest position. I'll just check that that screw is tight and check that the B lever moves freely and that the spring for the B lever is sitting in its groove on this post. That all looks good. Right, so that flash contact can go on next. That flash contact sits on that post. Now, unlike the earlier shutters which had a loose standoff that went on there, this has got a fixed standoff. So it just sits on the top like that. There's a washer that goes on the top of that, and that goes around the top of that post. And then there's a screw here. I'll get that screw run down. Oops. Knock that thing off its post. Oh, my screwdriver's magnetised. I've got to do something about that. Okay, I can run that screw down now. Check that that flash contact moves easily. It does. Alright. Just seeing what we should put in next so we can see what we're doing. Let's put the shutter release in place. It's this piece. It's much the same as on the earlier model. It lifts the B lever amongst other things. Allows the B lever to drop into place. Okay, so I'll put a little wipe of molybdenum paste on there. This drops down that shaft there. I've got this round back to front. It drops down there. This arm comes in underneath the B lever so that it can lift the B lever up. This arm drops into the fork in this thing. So that's the piece that releases the shutter. It drops into that fork. It was not the self-timer as I suspected, and now you can see that if I press the shutter release, it lifts this piece. And it would allow the B lever to drop in place. So when the shutter release is pressed, it lifts this piece, which allows the blade actuating ring to move and effectively release the shutter. And the B lever dropped in nicely, so that worked. So that's part of the shutter release mechanism. How does it release the main cam? Perhaps it doesn't have to. Here's our main cam. It drops in there like that. And that's latched in the cocked position, but what's holding it? Nothing. Nothing. There's no catch directly on the main cam. It is caught because the mechanism, the blade actuating ring, can't move until this thing is lifted by the shutter release. So there's no catch directly on the cam. The cam, it relies on the blade actuating ring being stopped from movement by this piece to keep the shutter in the cocked state. Well, that's interesting. So I'll take this back out because I want to clean it, and we'll have a look at its spring, the main spring for the shutter, and in this case really the only spring for the shutter. As we can see from here, I'll get this out, see if we can focus on this a bit better. Yes, if we take this leg of the spring as being at 12 o'clock, this one is most definitely rounded at about 4 o'clock, so that is quite a tired spring. I wouldn't expect that to work particularly well. Yeah, that's very interesting. So that I'm going to have to give that a little twist with my magic spring twisting tool and see if we can return that to something like the state it was when it was relatively new. The alternative is to replace it with a new old stock spring, but I think I've only got 4 of those, and they cost a lot of money, so we won't be doing that. Well, here's the tool I use. I'll put that spring on there, make sure that its little tab is seated. Put the case over the top. Now, when this is in the correct position, its rest position, those 2 yellow dots should be aligned. Now, they're miles away from alignment. That's another indication that that spring is very tired. So now I'm going to rotate this, pushing these pieces together as I do it. And that's about as far as I want to take it, where that yellow one comes round to the red dot. In our rest position now, you can see that the rest position is effectively with our 2 yellow dots together. And at that stage, if we take that leg as being at 12 o'clock, this is at 2 o'clock, that's like a new spring. That's what a new spring would look like. What I've done is I've unwound that spring. Now that's basically the same practice as taking a spring that's lost a bit of tension and bending it back up so that it's got more tension in its rest position, which is quite commonly done, of course, with springs when you haven't got a new one to go there. And I've effectively done that here. This spring That's not a round cross section, that spring. That's flat. It's wider in that plane than it is in width. So basically it's like a long bar that's been wound into a spiral. And all I've done is I've bent that bar back up a bit, effectively. But what it means is that the spring will have more tension than it previously had at the rest position, at the point where the blades are fully closed or almost fully closed. It means that the shutter will tend to behave itself, because if it's got any little bit of stickiness in there and the spring is very tired, that's when you have problems, because the blades don't want to pull back into the closed position correctly. So let me clean this with a bit of naphtha. We'll put a little bit of molybdenum paste around to lubricate places I would rather lubricate. I'm giving that spring a wipe out on the inside. It's almost certainly lubricated with graphite grease, but like all old grease, it will have gathered up contaminants over time. So taking a bit of molybdenum paste, you may well ask why I use molybdenum paste. It's because I've got it. It's called dry molybdenum paste. It's not exactly dry, but it certainly doesn't have a runny binder. Right, let's pop the main cam in here. Before I do that, I'm going to lubricate 2 studs on the blade actuating ring, here and here. That's where the main cam picks it up. I'm going to run some on this little tab on the blade actuating ring here, where it's going to drop into this thing, which will hold that thing closed. This is where the B lever catches it. It's not exactly necessary to run some on there, but I did anyway. There are lubrication charts for various shutters. They're always interesting to read through. They always tell you use this magic compound number 1 to lubricate this, and magic compound number 2 to lubricate that. Of course, the magic compounds they reference aren't available anywhere. They were something special that was made for a very short period of time, and you have to use your common sense and experience to tell you what would make a good substitute. Okay, so I'm just looking at that, making sure that's seated. This is the flash contact here is scraping on the table, so I'm just going to pop this up on this piece here, which is actually the back of the focus mount for a 3C, but it makes a good table to stand this on. And I've got to hook this spring up and around, and catches in at this point here on the bracket. This is always awkward. But then if it was easy, they wouldn't need experts, as they say. Now it's lifted out of that hole in the plate. Get that back again. Fitting these springs is absolutely no problem when they're tired and worn out. It's a terrible problem when they're good and they're where they should be, which is what we face here today. At the end of that spring up, I'm going to bring that round and hook it into that post there. Okay, so that's all in place. Let's cock this. see what happens. Now cocking that, basically what we've done is we have connected this main cam is now in contact with the blade actuating ring, and the blade actuating ring is the only thing stopping that mechanism from running down, and the blade actuating ring is locked by this funny shaped lever here, and when we press the shutter release here, it lifts this lever which allows the blade actuating ring to run and fire the shutter like that. So that explains that little mystery of the funny shaped piece. Here is the cocking shaft that runs through from the back of the shutter and cocks the main cam. I'm just going to put a light wipe of molybdenum paste on that, and that should run through. Is it going to clear the back of this case? I think so. And the tab on this, got a little tab here, that drops down into this space here. Just like that. Of course, yes, it does foul the back of this mount. Okay, so I'll just set this up on a block of wood so I can see what I'm doing and refocus you. Okay, so we've got virtually everything back in there. The speed trains, and the control lever for the self timer that goes on from the back. So let's get that in place. That's comparatively simple. And the control lever for the diaphragm, of course. So these pieces and their associated screws. 1, 2, 3. Down on the table where you probably can't see them. Okay, let me clean these pieces up. So here I'm just wiping everything to get rid of any contaminants, dust and dirt, old grease, that sort of thing. You can see it comes off quite dirty, so there's plenty there. This is the shim that goes through. It's quite highly polished, and it's quite low friction because of that. Sometimes you may see that that piece has some surface corrosion to it, a little bit of feel of roughness to it. And you can polish that off with a bit of brass soap. You can lubricate it with a lead from a soft pencil, graphite pencil, and that'll work well. This piece just looks a bit grimy. It looks more like fingerprint grease to me than anything else. There was a nice control number on the back there written in red pencil. Which we've now taken off. And that most certainly dated to either the Kodak factory or the Deckel factory where they're making the shutter itself. Okay, so we've got these pieces. Let's put them on the shutter. Here's our shutter. I'll take this piece, because I've got the molybdenum paste there, I'm just going to give that a wipe through the inside. Now this pin needs to drop down in the case into that gap between the end of the slot and that spring. otherwise the spring won't be on the right side of it. Just like that. Our shim or spacer only goes on one way. It's got a tab on it there which drops into a notch on the case there. So we'll get that in position. Now I don't know what happened to my all-purpose manipulating toothpick, but we can always start another one. Okay, so that goes on there like that. Our diaphragm setting lever, let's just close that diaphragm down a bit because it only opens up to f3.5. So here's this plate here. It's got two tabs on it, here and here. Now they bend up towards the front of the shutter. We're looking at the back of the shutter at the moment, of course. This slot runs over this point here. This little hole catches on that pin on the back of the diaphragm there. That sits on there like that. Now if there was any sign of roughness on that part, I would be polishing it off, and I'd probably be lubricating that with a bit of graphite from a lead pencil. So I've got one screw in position there. I'm just checking that the diaphragm moves smoothly, and it does. I've got the other screws in place. You may find that there's some distortion on this plate, particularly if people have been pushing and shoving at the aperture setting dial, in which case it might not move as freely as you'd like. Let's just check that. That moves nicely, that's good. If it doesn't move nicely, if it doesn't move freely, what you can try is first loosening one of your screw heads and trying it again, and if it suddenly becomes loose, then the problem is probably related to where that screw head is. And what you can do is you can take your lead pencil and just rub a bit of that graphite either side of those screw heads, and then work the lever, which will distribute that little bit of graphite on that surface, and that will often make things work much smoother. Okay, so that's all in place. What have we got to do here now? Speed trains. I don't know what state these are in. Let's find out. I'll just stretch that out. The operating lever for this is underneath. Now the operating lever for this is usually on the top because it's activated by the internal cocking ring, which this shutter doesn't have. So the operating lever is underneath this, and it's activated by the blade actuating ring as that swings back. Let's find out what happens with this. Well, it runs reasonably smoothly. That's quite good. That should clean up well. Let's try the speed train here. And that's returning to its rest position without any problems either. So these I will place in a small jar of naphtha, and I will place that small jar of naphtha in an ultrasonic cleaner so it's surrounded by water, and give it 10 minutes or so, pull those out, blow away any naphtha and any rubbish that's suspended in the naphtha, and lubricate these two with some graphite powder, and then we'll put them in the shutter. Alright, I have my speed trains all cleaned and lubricated with graphite powder. Let's see if we can get them in place. So I want to cock the shutter, which brings the main cam back out of the way so that we can put the speed train in. Now when putting the speed train in, let's get these correct screws here. this tab here on the speed train, you need to pull that back so that it clears this tab on the mechanism plate. It must be sitting pulled back behind that, not sitting on top of it. Otherwise things will get damaged when you do the screws up. So the screw at this end is the pivot, because at the other end in this position the hole in the mechanism plate is oversized, which allows you some adjustment, and basically you can move the end of the speed train in closer towards the centre of the shutter for greater engagement of the speed train with the cam, or you can move it towards the outside of the case for lesser engagement with the speed train. And the difference there is with greater engagement it will slow the shutter up, with less engagement it will speed the shutter up. Now let's just fire the shutter and see what sort of a speed we get. That sounded pretty good and it sounded pretty smooth. I've got this speed train in fairly close to the centre because we know we have a good main spring. If the spring was tired we'd probably have that in further out. Now I'm just going to drop my speed train into position, my self timer or delay action into position. That dropped in nicely. That's held in with a single screw. At this end of the speed train there's a little head on the underside of the speed train which drops into a little hole in the mechanism plate and locates it. There's no adjustment for the speed train. So let's try cocking the shutter and seeing if the self timer works. I'll cock the shutter. We'll set the self timer, and I'm not sure how this is set on this shutter. Let's find out. If we fire the shutter, yes, the self timer starts running down because the blade actuating ring moved to push against the lever on the self timer, and there, as the timer's timed out, it's released the shutter itself by pulling back this little tab which released the blade actuating ring to allow it to continue, which opened the shutter and then closed it again. So that all looks like it's working quite smoothly to me. I can test this. We don't have any internal cocking ring on this shutter. It's quite a bare bones construction in there. I'm just going to blow some of that graphite powder that I can see out of there. Must have been a little pocket of it hiding in the speed train. This ring. So lubrication for this is simple. I just wipe once around the centre, and where this groove here, all those lumps and bumps there, they operate the lever on the retard gear train, and I usually just wipe through those positions, fit this in place, make sure that the B lever is not trapped. Here's our speed cams there popped out through there, and while I'm testing it I normally fit the front retaining ring in position. Look at the way that runs on nice and smooth. That's how they should go. And the shutter should now be working nicely. Let's see what happens if we set it to 1/8 of a second. 1/8 of a second would be right there with that pin on that plateau of the speed settings ring. And what happens if we release the shutter? Let's find out. That sounded a little bit fast to me, so I need to test that. Let's see if you can see it. It certainly sounded a little bit fast. I would guess it's within half a stop. What's it like on a 15th of a second? That would be there. And there should be still a noticeable delay with that shutter. Yeah, that's fast. So I'm going to need to adjust the speeds there. There are two ways of adjusting speeds. One is to swing the speed train in for greater engagement with the cam, as previously mentioned. So we'll try that. We'll just cock the shutter because we need access to that adjustment screw there, and this arm comes across and blocks that when the shutter's fired. So we need to cock the shutter, slacken that screw off, it wasn't even tight, move my speed train in for maximum engagement with the cam, nip that screw back up, put the plate back on, and put my retaining ring in place. That's just to stop the plate coming adrift while I'm testing it. Okay, and that's set in the 1/8 of a second position. Let's see if there's any difference in the sound of that. Still sounded fast to me. Let's try the 15th of a second. That certainly sounded fast. Okay, so there is another way of making speed change. Well, there's a couple of ways, but the next way you would normally do it is, this is the pin on here that interacts with these humps on this cam, and that pin is bent slightly inwards at the moment, which means that the cam pushes this out further, which means that there's less engagement, or there's less timing required of the speed cam here. So if I straighten that pin up, it means that the cam will move in closer. It means there will be a greater engagement of the speeds settings here, and it will slow the shutter down, which is what I want to do. So what I'm doing is I'm looking closely at that pin to see if it's bent already, because quite commonly they are, and it does appear that it is bent in slightly. So what I've got to do is grab that pin and just twist it outwards slightly. You can do that with a pair of needle nose pliers. I've got a hollow punch which is a good fit on that pin, and that allows me to get that on there and lever it out very slightly with quite good control. And most importantly, it doesn't make a mess of that pin. If you put pliers on there and bend it out with pliers, inevitably you'll scar that shaft. You may even create a flat on it, and it means that the settings plate here won't slide smoothly over it. It'll feel rough. It might still work fine as a shutter, but it doesn't feel as nice when you're changing the speeds. There'll be a certain amount of roughness there. So it's best not to abuse that pin, or abuse the shape of it, so that it'll move nicely over those humps and bumps, which of course I carefully put a wipe of molybdenum paste over to lubricate. So I'll find my settings hollow punch and just make a wee adjustment.